Medieval warfare was not just about swords, shields, and shining armor. It was a world of brutal close combat, constant danger, and weapons designed to break through even the toughest defenses. Some of them were so destructive, so hard to control, and so dangerous in the chaos of battle, that even experienced soldiers feared using them. In this video, we're looking at 10 medieval weapons from Europe that earned terrifying reputations on the battlefield. Number 1. The poleaxe. In late medieval Europe, one of the most feared weapons to actually trust in a real fight was the poleaxe. On paper, it looked perfect. It gave a fighter reach, several striking surfaces, and a design that could cut, crush, and thrust. In practice, that same versatility made it demanding. The head was built from multiple elements, usually an axe blade, a rear hammer or beak, and a top spike, all fixed to a long haft. That meant the weapon could answer different problems, especially heavy armor. But it also meant the man using it had to judge distance, timing, and angle almost perfectly. A bad choice could waste the best chance he would get. Medieval masters treated the poleaxe seriously enough to write dedicated material on it, and that alone tells you it was not some crude peasant stick. It was a technical battlefield weapon, and also a formal dual weapon for men who expected armored combat at close range. Royal Armies describes it as a two-handed infantry weapon, made to hack, crush, and pierce armor plates. And the Met notes that it was essentially the Western European answer to the halberd, with extra reinforcement to survive violent contact. That sounds impressive, and it was, but the danger went both ways. Fiore dei Liberi, one of the best-known medieval fight masters, basically warns that if your first committed blow misses, the poleaxe can become more trouble than help. That is the part people often miss.
A poleaxe was feared not only because of what it could do to an opponent, but because it demanded commitment. Once you stepped in and swung hard, you were exposed, and the fight could instantly turn into grappling, visor grabbing, and short-range wrestling with steel in both hands. So the poleaxe was brutal, but even more than that, it was unforgiving. And once fighters started looking for smaller answers to plate armor, the next weapons became even more ruthless in a tighter space. Number 2. The warhammer. If the poleaxe was the full-size answer to armor, the warhammer was the compact answer. This is one of the weapons that really changed the image of medieval combat, because it shows that once plate armor improved, a clean sword cut was not always the most efficient solution. A warhammer put force into a very small area. One face could hit with a heavy concussive blow, while the spike or beak on the other side was built to puncture or bite into vulnerable spots. The Met specifically describes warhammers carried by armored cavalrymen as having one side for shock and the other for piercing. That combination made the weapon practical, but it also made it psychologically harsh. A knight using a hammer was admitting something important. This was no longer a fight about elegant cuts. It was about getting through defenses by concentrated impact. That alone changes the whole mood of the weapon. Another reason soldiers could fear using it was range. Many surviving warhammers are not huge. Some are compact sidearms, not long battlefield polearms. That meant the user had to get very close to an opponent who was also armored, armed, and trained. There was no safe distance, no long sweeping recovery, and not much room for hesitation. You had to close, strike hard, and stay balanced. Too soft, and the blow lost value. Too wild, and you gave away your position. This is why the warhammer feels so cold in comparison to the romantic image of the sword.
It was efficient, direct, and hard to use casually. It also worked well as a backup weapon for mounted men because it could hang from belt or saddle equipment and be brought into action fast. So, yes, it was brutal against armor. But what really made it feared was that it forced men into one of the most uncomfortable truths of medieval battle. Sometimes, the smartest weapon was the one that looked least heroic. And if the hammer concentrated force through a point, the next weapon did something similar with even less complexity. Number 3. The mace. The mace looked simple, and that was part of what made it so menacing. There was nothing decorative about the basic idea. Instead of depending on a sharp edge, the mace relied on mass, momentum, and a striking head that could stay effective even when armor was too good for clean cuts. The Met describes the late 15th century steel mace as a horseman's weapon carried alongside a sword or other arms, and surviving examples often show flanged heads designed to focus impact. Some later pieces in the Royal Armouries collection have heavy, multi-flanged heads with pointed projections, which tells you how far armor-breaking logic had gone. The mace mattered because it stripped combat down to function. You did not need a long slicing motion. You needed control, wrist strength, and the nerve to hit hard in a space where your opponent was doing the same. That made it useful, but it also made it easy to underestimate. A sword gives you a little more freedom in how you threaten distance. A mace is blunter in every sense. It tells both fighters that the exchange may be short, violent, and decided by one opening. That is exactly why soldiers could fear relying on it. Against armored men, it made sense. Against quicker opponents, or in a confused melee, its shorter reach could become a real problem. Once the fight got crowded, the mace user had to manage timing carefully, because a missed blow could leave him open before he recovered.
That practical reputation is probably why it stayed relevant for so long. When armor and battlefield conditions kept changing, the mace still made sense. And once warriors realized that even swords had to adapt to armor by turning from cutters into stiff thrusting tools, the logic behind the next weapon becomes obvious. Number 4. The estoc. The estoc is one of the clearest signs that armor changed medieval fighting from the inside out. At a glance, it still looks like a sword, but it does not behave like the sword most people imagine. The blade was long, narrow, sharply pointed, and often so stiff that cutting was no longer the main point at all. The Met calls it a thrusting sword, sometimes known as a tuck or Panzerstecher, literally an armor piercer, designed to puncture mail or find the gaps in plate armor. That tells you almost everything. The estoc existed because armor forced swordsmanship into a harder, narrower lane. Instead of broad slashes, the user was looking for seams, joints, and openings rather than trying to simply chop through plate. Royal Armouries notes that later medieval swords developed more rigid, needle-like points for exactly this reason. That sounds clever, and it was, but it also made the estoc an unforgiving weapon to trust. If your target was moving, if the angle was wrong, or if the fight collapsed into messy body contact, the estoc could lose some of its advantage. It was specialized. That specialization is what made it feared. A good estoc in skilled hands was frightening because it turned armor from a guarantee of safety into a puzzle with vulnerable seams. But the same weapon also asked a lot from the man holding it. He needed precision more than flourish. He needed calm under pressure. And he needed the confidence to thrust at tiny openings while another armed man was trying to crash into him. So, the estoc was brutal in a very different way from a hammer or a mace. It was not about smashing through a defense. It was about treating the defense like something to bypass. In other words, it was a weapon built for the part of medieval combat that looks the least cinematic and the most real. And once a fight got even closer than that, swords often gave way to something smaller, nastier, and even more feared at arm's length. Number 5. The rondel dagger. If there is one weapon that shows how ugly armored combat could become at close range, it is the rondel dagger. It often served as a backup weapon, but that does not make it secondary in importance. Royal Armories says rondel daggers were widely used from the 14th to the 16th centuries and were considered knightly weapons. Their blades were often stiff and pointed, made for stabbing and for finding gaps in armor. The museum is very clear about the intended use, not by describing gore, but by explaining that the weapon was suited to weak points and openings between plates. That is the real reason men feared it. A rondel dagger meant the fight had moved beyond striking distance into grappling distance. At that range, armor was still valuable, but it was no longer a wall. It became something an opponent could work around. Surviving examples in the Met and the British Museum show exactly the kind of narrow, sturdy points you would expect from a weapon designed for pressure and precision, not showy cuts. In other words, if you were using a rondel dagger for real, the battle had already become intimate in the worst possible way. That is why this weapon deserves a place on a list like this. It was small, yes, but it belonged to one of the most feared moments in medieval combat. The moment when heavier weapons were no longer enough and the fight had to be finished by hand, leverage, and a short blade. It was also common enough to matter. A terrifying weapon does not need to be huge. Sometimes it is the one almost everyone carries because everyone knows the fight might end there.
And once that same logic moved from individual finishers to mass infantry weapons, the battlefield started to change in a much bigger way. Number 6. The halberd. The halberd was one of the great equalizers of late medieval Europe, and that is exactly why it could be feared by the men told to use it. Britannica describes it as a staff weapon with an axe blade, a pick, and a top spike, usually around 5 to 6 feet long, and important in Central Europe from the 14th through the 16th century. Royal Armories goes further and ties it directly to the rise of Swiss infantry, explaining that the halberd could slash, thrust, hook, and unhorse mounted men-at-arms. In plain terms, this was a weapon built to let foot soldiers challenge the battlefield status of armored horsemen. That is a huge deal. The halberd was brutal because it attacked from several angles at once. The spike could threaten at range, the blade could strike with body weight behind it, and the rear hook or fluke could drag, catch, or disrupt. Britannica and Royal Armories both stress its usefulness against mounted opponents, while older military histories point out something just as important. The halberdier paid for that power with exposure. A full, committed swing left the user vulnerable if the line around him broke. That is one reason soldiers could fear it. A halberd is deadly inside a disciplined formation. Outside that formation, or after a bad miss, it becomes much harder to manage. So the weapon depended not just on courage, but on group cohesion. That fits the wider story of medieval warfare. As infantry got better trained and more organized, weapons like the halberd became battle winners. But for the individual man in the front rank, the experience was still terrifying. He had to hold his ground, read distance, and trust the men next to him while facing cavalry or heavily armed infantry. The halberd was not feared because it was exotic. It was feared because it worked, and because using it properly meant standing exactly where many soldiers least wanted to stand. And in England,
A related staff weapon took that same anti-cavalry logic in a slightly different direction. Number 7. The bill. The bill does not always get the same attention as the halberd, but in medieval England it was one of the most practical and dangerous infantry weapons on the field. Royal Armories explains that it grew out of the agricultural bill hook and entered military use in the mid-13th century. By the time of the Hundred Years' War, it had become a serious staff weapon with a cutting blade, a reinforced top spike, and a rear hook or fluke that could be used to interfere with mounted men, even to cut reins or pull riders down. That origin matters because the bill shows how medieval warfare often turned work tools into military solutions. But once adapted for war, this was no farm tool. It was a purpose-built infantry weapon with several functions packed into one long haft. What made it brutal was not just the shape. It was the way the weapon let foot soldiers interfere with elite cavalry at awkward angles. A rider who stayed out of sword range could still be snagged, disrupted, or stabbed. The English clearly valued that logic. The fear factor, though, came from the job billmen had to do. Like halberdiers, they had to stand in the path of fast, armored opponents and get the timing right. The hook that made the weapon so useful also demanded nerve. Miss the horse, miss the rider, or overcommit, and the fight could turn against you very quickly. Royal Armories also notes the use of metal langets to reinforce the haft, a reminder that these weapons were expected to take heavy punishment in contact. So, the bill deserves more respect than it usually gets. It was cheaper than noble arms, but not crude. It was effective because it attacked the structure of mounted warfare itself.
And if the bill represents a smart military adaptation, the next weapon shows what happens when urban militias find an even rougher answer to charging knights. Number 8. The goedendag. The goedendag is one of those weapons that sounds almost too strange to be real, which is probably why people remember it. But it was real enough for the Met to preserve a 14th century Flemish head for one, and historians still connect it strongly with the Flemish militia tradition and the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302. In simple terms, this was a heavy staff weapon associated with urban infantry, especially in Flanders. Modern scholarship still debates the exact details of how every example was used, but the basic image is clear enough. A thick staff with a strong iron spike, meant to meet the shock of an attack at close range. That already tells you why soldiers could fear using it. The goedendag was not about elegance, reach, or flexibility. It was about nerve. Men with these weapons had to stand and receive cavalry pressure instead of retreating from it. Britannica's summary of the battle at Courtrai makes clear that the Flemish militia beat French mounted forces by taking position on difficult ground and denying them a clean charge. The goedendag fits that kind of fighting perfectly. It was simple, brutal, and best when used by disciplined men who refused to panic. That last part is important. A weapon like this is terrifying because its success depends on the user holding his place until the last moment. There is no room for fantasy there. Either the formation holds or it does not. That is also why the goedendag feels so medieval in the most direct sense. It sits right at the point where wealthy mounted warriors discovered that determined infantry, armed with the right tools and standing in the right place, could ruin the old assumptions of battle. So even if it was less refined than a halberd or pollaxe, it carried a very serious message. You did not need an expensive knightly weapon to stop a knight. And once missile troops pushed that same logic from contact range to distance, the battlefield became even less comfortable for the armored elite. Number 9. The crossbow. Few medieval weapons gained such a reputation for cold efficiency as the crossbow. The reason is not hard to see. Crossbows stored power mechanically and released it through a short, heavy bolt that could hit with frightening force. The Met's work on European crossbows describes them as one of the dominant weapons in world history before they were fully eclipsed by firearms. Its collection notes also explain why the bolts were so sturdy. The power of the weapon demanded thicker projectiles, including heads shaped to resist bending on impact with armor. Royal Armories adds another key detail by showing the equipment around the weapon, including cranaquins and other devices used to span high-powered bows. In other words, many serious crossbows were strong enough that a man often needed a mechanical aid just to draw them. That power made them feared by enemies, rulers, and even churchmen. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council famously condemned the use of crossbows and bows against Christians, which tells you just how morally unsettling elite society found missile warfare of this kind, even if the ban did not hold in practice. The Swiss National Museum also points out how the crossbow acquired a reputation as an assassin's weapon and cites medieval descriptions that emphasized its ability to punch through armor and drop a man suddenly. That suddenness is a big part of the fear. A sword fight announces itself. A crossbow strike can end the matter before close combat even starts. At the same time, soldiers could fear using crossbows for practical reasons too. Powerful versions were slower to reload and could leave the shooter exposed if the line collapsed. So the crossbow combined two things medieval fighters hated: distance and certainty.
It allowed men without the long physical training demanded by the strongest bows to threaten heavily protected targets from outside sword range. And once Europe accepted explosive weapons as the next step beyond stored mechanical power, the crossbow finally met a rival that was even more disruptive. Number 10. The hand cannon. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had started to experiment with something even more unsettling than the crossbow: handheld firepower based on gunpowder. Royal Armories places gunpowder technology in Western Europe by the mid-13th century, notes guns in Florence by 1326, and shows that the same period also produced the earliest surviving illustration of a gun. Its 100 Years' War material includes a 1405 image of a soldier firing a hand cannon, while the Royal Armories collection also preserves the famous Danzig handgun, dated roughly 1350 to 1430, and small enough to show how early portable guns could look. That does not mean every battlefield immediately filled with handgunners. What it means is that once the principle existed, warfare changed permanently. The hand cannon was feared because it introduced explosive force into the hands of an individual fighter. Royal Armories notes that a medieval handgun would have been mounted on a wooden tiller or stock and fired by applying a smoldering match to the priming powder. In other words, the shooter was handling flame, powder, timing, and aim all at once. Some early surviving pieces, like the Danzig handgun, were surprisingly compact, but compact did not mean simple. It was still primitive, slow, and awkward compared with later firearms, but the military shift was massive, and everyone on the field could feel it. Royal Armories even notes that firepower may have appeared in smaller forms at Crécy in 1346, and that artillery kept growing in importance across the war. The old world of blades, lances, and mechanical bows was no longer the whole story.
It was another reason these early guns frightened people, and it was not only what happened downrange. Gunpowder weapons were still new enough that rulers themselves could die in accidents involving their own pieces, as James II of Scotland did in 1460 when a cannon burst beside him. That was artillery, not a hand cannon, but it captures the atmosphere around early gunpowder perfectly. These weapons promised huge military value, but they also carried the uneasy sense that men were handling controlled explosions in an age still learning how to manage them.
So the hand cannon belongs on this list not because it was already the perfect battlefield weapon. It belongs here because it marked the moment when medieval soldiers had to fear something beyond steel, the arrival of personal explosive fire.